Hi everyone. Today we'll finish off the early colonial period up to the beginning of the 18th century by looking at two historical events, one in New England and one in Virginia, that had a formative influence on shaping the future of British North America. And finally, by taking a brief look at the last two colonies to emerge in the 17th century along the Atlantic seaboard, Pennsylvania and South Carolina. The Puritans called the bloodiest Indian conflict in their history King Philip's War, after the Wampanoag sachem named Metacom, but known to the English as King Philip. Here we have a sketch of Metacom. He was the son of Massasoit, who had originally befriended the Pilgrims at Plymouth in the 1620s and participated in the so-called First Thanksgiving Dinner. Metacom quietly prepared for a war that he considered unavoidable. In the spring of 1675, the Plymouth colonists provoked the confrontation by seizing, trying, and hanging 3 Wampanoag Indians for supposedly murdering a Prayingtown Indian who'd served as a colonial informant. The executions infuriated the young Wampanoag warriors who, as we can see from this sketch, struck out on their own, attacking isolated colonial homesteads, looting, and burning. The uprising spread with deadly effect during the summer and fall as the initial Wampanoag victories emboldened other bands with their own grievances. Indiscriminate Puritan counterattacks on neutral bands created additional enemies, including the Narragansett. Numbering about 4,000, the Narragansett were the largest and most powerful native people in the region. Although the Puritans imagined that Metacom was the evil mastermind of the rebellion, in fact, every Indian band fought under its own leaders. Here we have a map that indicates the major attacks of both Indian and English forces during the conflict fought between 1675 and 1676. During the summer and fall of 1675, Indian rebels assailed 52 of the region's 90 towns, destroying 12 of them. Drawing upon the grim lesson in total war taught by the colonists in the Pequot War, the Indians often killed entire colonial families, including women and children. The early Indian victories bolstered their confidence while shocking and demoralizing the Puritans. Growing numbers of colonial refugees fled from the frontier to burden the resources of the coastal towns. For decades, the New England colonists had labored to remake the landscape by constructing churches, houses, fences, and barns, and by unleashing their livestock. To reverse the alienation of their land, the Indian rebels systematically burned, killed, mutilated, and desecrated all of those marks of English civilization. The Indians came to regard every dying colonist, every burning house, every destroyed church as mounting evidence that the English God was no match for their own returning spiritual power. As the Puritans saw it, their Bible commonwealth was failing, consigned by God to a scourging by the forces of Satan as a punishment for the sins of New England. To vindicate their God and prove their own worthiness, the Puritans felt compelled to destroy their Indian enemies. Every dead Indian and burned wigwam manifested the resurgent power of the Christian God and his renewed approval of his chosen people, the Puritans. In this grim equation, destruction to the other measured God's favor. During 1675, the colonists could rarely find and attack their more mobile and elusive foes. As a result, many settlers succumbed to the temptation to attack, plunder, and kill those Indians they could easily locate, the praying town Indians. Angry colonists regarded all Indians as their enemies and considered the praying town Indians to be insidious spies and covert raiders. To secure the praying Indians from genocide and from joining the enemy, the colonial authorities removed them to two cold and barren islands in Boston Harbor, where hundreds died from exposure, malnutrition, and disease, or were stolen by slave traders during the hard winter of 1675 to 1676. In the early months of 1676, the desperate colonial leaders swallowed their pride and sought help from Indian allies to the south, notably the formidable Mohawk of the Iroquois Five Nations. In return for presents and promises of trade, the Mohawk agreed to escalate their destructive raids on their old enemies, the New England Algonquin tribes. During the spring and summer of 1676, the Mohawk helped turn the tide of the war in favor of the colonists. They taught them how to avoid ambushes and how to track down and destroy their Indian enemies. During the spring of 1676, the New England Indians began to run out of food and ammunition, just when they faced increasing attacks from their more numerous and improved foes. During the summer of 1676, the Indian resistance collapsed, as one demoralized band after another surrendered. In August, Metacom himself died in battle, shot down by a praying town Indian serving with the Puritans, a moment captured in this sketch. The English cut off Metacom's head for display on a post atop a brick watchtower in Plymouth, where his father had peacefully welcomed the Pilgrims over half a century before. In the late 17th century, tourists did not visit Plymouth to see the now celebrated rock. Instead, they came to gape at Metacom's skull, like the famous minister Cotton Mather, captured in this sketch, who angrily wrenched off and took away Metacom's jawbone, as if to symbolically complete his eternal silencing. The bitter and bloody war had devastated the Puritan settlements of the region, but it virtually annihilated the Indian villages of New England. The conflict killed at least 1,000 colonists and some 3,000 Indians, a quarter of their population. Rather than treat their captives as prisoners of war, the Puritans defined the Indians as traitors, executing the chiefs and enslaving others for sale in the West Indies. For several weeks, leading Puritan ministers debated whether Metacom's 9-year-old son should be executed for his father's rebellion. Opting for what they considered mercy, the Puritans sold the boy and his mother into slavery. Some of the defeated Indians escaped northward to take refuge among the Abenaki peoples of northern New England and parts of New France, carrying with them a bitter hatred of the Puritans. Those who remained in the region lived as small minorities on a changed land among the invaders. In his published account of King Philip's War, which we have the cover of from an early 19th century edition, the Reverend William Hubbard warned readers to waste no sympathy for the dead or enslaved Indian children. As he argued, Being all young serpents of the same brood, the subduing or taking of so many ought to be acknowledged as another signal victory and pledge of divine favor to the English. Acts of war generate acts of narration, so that both become joined in a common purpose, defining the geographical, political, cultural, and sometimes racial and national boundaries between peoples. Waging, writing, and remembering a war all shape its legacy, all draw boundaries. In the case of King Philip's War, the colonists' writings were pivotal to their victory, a victory that drew new, firmer boundaries between English and Indian people, and between English and Indian land. English colonists constructed a language that proclaimed themselves to be neither cruel colonizers like the Spanish, nor savage natives like the Indians. The fact that the loser's name for the conflict has not survived is part of what the fighting was about in the first place. It was a contest for meaning which the colonists won. While the black legend and lesson of Spanish cruelties dictated that the New England colonists shun cruelty against the Indians, the British suppression of Ireland suggested that cruelty against barbarians might not be cruelty at all. The Puritans could avoid the possibility of degenerating into savagery by waging the war and winning it by whatever means necessary, and then writing about it to win it again, providing both a victory of wounds and of words. Even if they inflicted on the Indians as much cruelty as the Spanish had, the Puritans found they could distance themselves from that cruelty in the words that they used to write about it, the same way the English had when writing about the Irish. They could save themselves from both Indian and Spanish barbarity. They could reclaim their Englishness. The colonists' identity had been compromised during King Philip's War by their merciless killing and abandoning of the codes of civil nations. By writing about the war, the colonists could reclaim civility. The writing itself would dress the English back up, undoing the damage of the war by making it clear what made a massacre as opposed to a victory. And virtually without exception, the Puritans viewed the taunts and acts of aggression by natives as expressions of mindless savagery or as divine retribution, rather than as calculated assaults on the English way of life. English indentured servants composed at least 3/4 of the emigrants to the Chesapeake during the 17th century, about 90,000 of the 120,000 total. Too poor to afford the 6-pound cost of a transatlantic passage, the servants mortgaged 4 to 7 years of their lives to a ship captain or a merchant who carried them to the Chesapeake for sale to tobacco planters. Here we have a sketch of indentured servants at work. Unpaid during their terms, the servants received basic food, clothing, and shelter, generally just sufficient to keep them alive and working. At the conclusion of a term, the master was supposed to endow his servant with what was called freedom dues, a new set of clothes, tools, and food. During the first half of the 17th century, Virginia and Maryland also provided freedmen, a person who'd survived and fulfilled the terms of their indenture, with 50 acres of land. Given that most people could never anticipate owning land in England, the Chesapeake colonies offered an opportunity unavailable at home. Of course, that chance required men and women to gamble their lives in a dangerous land of hard work and deadly diseases. Before 1620, most of Virginia's indentured servants were forcibly transported, often as criminals, punished for vagrancy and petty theft. After 1620, the majority were technically volunteers, but their poverty in England constrained their exercise of free choice. The push of unemployment and hunger in England combined with the pull of Virginia opportunity to draw servants to the Chesapeake. Before 1640, most indentured servants endured harsh but short lives. Having staked their health in pursuit of farms, most lost their gamble, finding graves before their terms expired. Despite the importation of 15,000 indentured servants between 1625 and 1640, Virginia's population increased by only 7,000. The servants died from the combination of disease and overwork. If it was in the planter's interest to keep his human chattel alive, it was also in his interest to extract as much work as possible before terms expired. Planters readily resorted to the whip, convinced that only fear and pain could motivate servants, whom they considered loose, vagrant people, vicious, and destitute of the means to live at home in England. Until their terms expired, the servants were fundamentally property rather than people. Masters readily bought and sold the contracts of their servants. Some masters even transferred servants to pay off gambling debts. In the Chesapeake, the county courts regulated indentured servitude on behalf of the master class, since most magistrates and judges were, of course, planters themselves. So blatant was the bias of the courts that even when servants died from especially brutal punishments, the preference was to exonerate masters of any wrongdoing. Instead of punishing abusive planters, the courts disciplined defiant servants by extending the terms of their indentures. Running away was widespread, but when caught, runaways had their terms of service extended by at least double the length of their absence, and often longer. At mid-century, around 1650, the Chesapeake became a bit healthier, which meant that many more servants started to live long enough to claim their freedom and farms. In part, health improved as many new plantations expanded upstream into locales with fresh running streams away from the stagnant lowlands, which favored malaria, dysentery, and typhoid fever. In addition, over time, a growing proportion of the population became, as the saying went, seasoned by surviving bouts with the local diseases. The so-called seasoned acquired a higher level of immunity, which they passed on to their offspring. But the overall improvement was only modest, in the sense that the Chesapeake colonists continued to die sooner than their counterparts in England, and especially those in the New England colonies. The mid-century moment of opportunity for common planters was also brief, only lasting about 15 years. Restricted to the frontier stage of development, social mobility quickly faded in the Chesapeake after 1665. The swelling number of producers and their increased productivity glutted the English market with tobacco, depressing prices below the cost of production. With 1 penny per pound, the minimum tobacco price for breaking even, planters faced ruin during the late 1660s and early 1770s, when the price fell to only half a penny per pound. Moreover, by 1665 the wealthiest and most well-connected planters had occupied all the best tobacco lands along navigable waterways, which pushed new freedmen onto inferior lands with higher transportation costs to market. The more competitive tobacco and land markets gave an edge to the wealthiest planters, who could ride out hard times and continue to buy up property and workers. In contrast with those of the preceding generation, the servants who became free during the 1670s enjoyed little economic success. Less than half became landowners, and none achieved wealth and high status. Instead of establishing an enduring land of opportunity, the Chesapeake's brief age of social mobility led to a plantation society of great wealth and increasing poverty. The royal governor of Virginia during the 1660s and 1670s, who we see in this portrait painting, was William Berkeley. The governor cultivated a following among the wealthiest and most ambitious planters. His favorites monopolized the major and lucrative public offices, and they received a disproportionate share in the grants of frontier land and of licenses to trade with the Indians for deerskins. For 15 years, beginning in 1661, Berkeley refused to allow any new election to the Virginia Assembly, instead perpetuating his cronies in power. By helping them, he helped himself. Unresponsive to their constituents, the assemblymen levied heavy and totally inequitable taxes to sustain an especially expensive colonial government that benefited the official elite. An assemblyman received 150 pounds of tobacco in pay per day in session, about 5 times in value what was paid to his counterpart and contemporary in colonial Massachusetts. Governor Berkeley annually collected a salary of 1,000 pounds. To put that in perspective, most emigrants mortgaged at least 4 years of their working lives to pay the 6-pound cost of a transatlantic passage to the Chesapeake. Small planters were fortunate to clear 3 pounds annually over and above expenses. The pay lavished on the elite came from taxes heaped upon the common planter. As one Crown official who investigated Virginia in these years testified, in his words, "A poor man who has only his labor to maintain himself and his family pays as much as a man who has 20,000 acres." Because Berkeley granted the best public lands in large tracts to his favorites, freedmen could rarely obtain their own farms after 1665. Instead, most had to rent land from the wealthiest planters. Such tenants composed about a third of Virginia's population by 1675. Frustrated in their dreams of landowning independence, the freedmen felt angry and aggrieved. Mostly unmarried and often armed with guns, the frustrated freedmen were restive and dangerous. Rather than pay rent, many freedmen moved to the frontier, where they violently competed with the Indians. In 1675, war erupted between the settlers and the Susquehannock, an Iroquoian-speaking people who dwelled north of the Potomac River. The war escalated as the settlers murdered chiefs who tried to negotiate for peace. Although relatively few, the Susquehannock were adept at hit-and-run raids that killed the families on dispersed and vulnerable frontier farms. Infuriated settlers demanded permission from the governor to exterminate all the natives on the frontier, the ostensibly peaceful as well as the openly hostile. Governor Berkeley opposed the genocidal proposal, for he and his friends cherished the profitable deerskin trade with the more peaceable Algonquin Indians. Berkeley also understood that a controlled, gradual frontier expansion better served the interest of the wealthiest planters, who wanted to retain common men as laborers and tenants rather than permit their dispersion to an open frontier as settlers. The disgruntled Virginians found a leader in the man we see in this sketch, Nathaniel Bacon, a 29-year-old charismatic newcomer to the colony. Bacon was raised in an English gentry family and enjoyed a better pedigree than virtually everyone but the governor, who happened to be his cousin by marriage. Although Berkeley had rewarded him with a seat on the governor's council, Bacon was an impetuous and ambitious man who was more than willing to turn against his cousin, the governor. To popular acclaim, Bacon led indiscriminate attacks on the Indians in open defiance of Berkeley's orders. He said the colonists should destroy, in his words, all Indians in general, for they were all enemies. Because friendly Algonquins were closer and easier to catch, they died in greater numbers than did the hostile and elusive Susquehannock. In early 1676, Berkeley declared Bacon guilty of treason, which led the rebel leader to march his armed followers against the governor in Jamestown. In part, Bacon's rebellion, as it came to be known, represented a division within the planter elite, a split between a cabal allied with the royal governor and a rival set of ambitious but frustrated planters who resented their relative lack of offices and other rewards. Bacon and his partners felt especially offended that Berkeley monopolized the Indian trade and denied their bid to purchase an interest. Determined to enjoy the perquisites and rewards of a hierarchical society, Bacon and his lieutenants intended no egalitarian revolution. To defeat the governor, however, the rebel leaders needed to recruit armed support among the common planters and servants by promising redress for their many grievances. In his most radical measure, Bacon promised immediate freedom to servants who deserted Berkeley's friends to join his rebellion. In his public manifesto, Bacon appealed directly to class resentments, declaring that, in his words, the poverty of the country is such that all the power and sway has got into the hands of the rich, who by extortionist advantages, having the common people in their debt, have always curbed and oppressed them in all manner of ways. Bacon implied that he would lower taxes and provide more and better lands to the freedmen. He also invited poor men to plunder the plantations of Berkeley's supporters. In September 1676, Bacon's men drove the governor and his supporters out of Jamestown and across Chesapeake Bay to refuge on the eastern shore. To discourage their return, Bacon burned Jamestown to the ground, an event captured in this illustration. A month later, Bacon suddenly died of dysentery, leaving his movement leaderless and divided. Assisted by armed merchant ships newly arrived from England, Berkeley returned to reassert his authority. In December and January, the rebellion collapsed. 23 of Bacon's followers were executed. In Bacon's rebellion, the great planters had received a scare. As a result, they felt compelled to build a more popular political base by becoming more solicitous of the smaller planters. By reducing taxes, the Virginia gentry reinvented themselves and Virginia politics. Relations between small and great planters improved at the turn of the century, as a surge in European demand for tobacco improved its price, and with it the income of all planters. Less burdened by taxes and enjoying greater prosperity, 18th century common planters began to regard their wealthy neighbors as powerful protectors of their common interests. The Virginia elite also recognized the popularity of Bacon's Indian policy. To maintain their political ascendancy, the great planters needed to lead rather than oppose wars meant to dispossess and destroy frontier Indians. Such wars united the free whites by providing convenient external, alien scapegoats for internal frustrations and inequalities, and by providing farms for the next generation of common planters. At the end of the 17th century, tensions between the common whites and the great planters also diminished as the numbers of indentured servants and new freedmen dwindled. In fact, indentured servants had completely vanished from most Chesapeake households by 1700. The great planters found that if they stopped importing indentured servants, there would be fewer to live out their terms and claim 50 acres of land that the great planters still coveted. They could continue to give free rein to their greed and thirst for power if they moved to an alternative labor source. The great planters of the Chesapeake, as we see indicated in this illustration, increasingly turned to African slaves for their plantation workforces. At the end of the 17th century, slaves became a better investment. As the moderating virulence of the local diseases increased life expectancy, planters became confident that their slaves would live and work long enough to repay their extra cost. It also helped that slave traders began to visit the Chesapeake in growing numbers, increasing the supply of slaves at stable prices, despite the growing demand. The number of slaves in Virginia surged from 300 in 1650 to 13,000 by 1700, when Africans made up 13% of the Chesapeake population. The planters shifted from servants to slaves for economic reasons, but that change incidentally improved their security against another rebellion by angry white freemen. During the 1660s and 1670s, the system of indentured servitude had annually unleashed a host of new freedmen into a society of diminishing opportunity. Frustrated and armed, they had rebelled in 1676. Thereafter, fewer servants meant fewer new freedmen who might stew in their frustration and rally to another rebel commander. While they no longer feared their poorer white neighbors, the planter elite developed a new dread of their enslaved Africans. To keep the slaves intimidated, the great planters needed a colonial militia drawn from the ranks of the common farmers. Consequently, in shifting to African slaves, the great planters acquired another reason to cultivate the common white men of the colony. Instead of a threat to social order, the armed whites became essential to its defense against slave rebellion. Prior to 1670, because they were so few in relative number, the planters developed no systematic legal code to regulate slaves. Early in the century, Chesapeake slavery remained amorphous and fluid. Some early planters treated their Africans like indentured servants, freeing the survivors after a few years of hard labor. More commonly, Masters permitted slaves to acquire and manage their own property, usually a few chickens, hogs, cattle, and small garden plots of maize and tobacco. By accumulating and selling property, dozens of early slaves in the Chesapeake were able to purchase their freedom and obtain the tools, clothing, and land necessary to join the ranks of common planters. Because the colonial laws did not yet forbid black progress, the black freedmen and women of the Virginia colony could move as they pleased, baptize their children, procure firearms, testify in court, buy and sell property, even vote. Some black men married white women, which was remarkable given their scarcity and high demand as wives for white men. A few black women took white husbands. During the late 17th century, however, Chesapeake masters in both Virginia and Maryland began to define slavery more strictly and acted to constrain both slaves and free blacks more severely. As Africans surged in number, they more readily sustained their own cultures. African languages, prayers, funerals, ritual scars, filed teeth, and drumming became more conspicuous, alarming masters. Fearful planters started to demand new laws, restricting movement and trading by blacks, lest they encourage theft and plots to rebel. No more than 4 slaves could assemble beyond their plantation, and none could leave it without a written pass from the master. Militia squads patrolled the roads to demand passes from traveling blacks. The masters also began forcing slaves to work longer days under stricter supervision. Saturday became a full rather than half work day, and some labored in the tobacco fields even on Sundays. The work of tobacco growing became so associated with slavery and with black-skinned Africans that it was reflected in the ads for different brands of the product. Here we have a series of examples that make the point. This last sketch here shows us Africans at work on a Chesapeake tobacco plantation. After devoting the daylight hours to tending tobacco, slaves often had to work late into the night, pounding corn by hand. Worse, from the vantage point of the enslaved, Virginia began to outlaw slaves' ability to purchase their freedom, out of a growing determination on the part of the planters to possess and own their African slaves for life. Terror became a frightful reality of blacks' lives, because as they grew more numerous and more conspicuously African, masters became convinced that only pain and fear could motivate them. Unlike servants, slaves could not be punished with added years of service. Instead, they had to feel the lash and suffer other torments. Here we have a couple of sketches depicting just a couple of the tortures devised for slaves. Branding of runaways, and a head torture device that kept a potential runaway or unruly slave from being able to eat or drink, or even lay their head down to sleep effectively. Chronic runaways had their toes chopped off or suffered castration. The colonial authorities held no master liable for the death of a slave from excessive punishment. New legislation toward the end of the 17th century promoted racial solidarity by all whites across class lines. In 1680, as we can see indicated in this illustration, Virginia prescribed 30 lashes on the bare back of any slave who threatened or struck a white person. This, of course, openly invited poor whites to bully and intimidate slaves with impunity, creating a common sense of mastery over all blacks by white Virginians, whether they owned a slave or not. The Virginia Assembly also worked to divide the races by forbidding interracial marriage and by criminalizing interracial sex when the woman was white. The Assembly quite pointedly passed in silence over the far more numerous cases in which white masters procreated with enslaved women. Raping a slave was not a crime. Marrying her was. A free white woman who had a mixed-race baby was subject to a 5-year sentence of indentured servitude. The child fared even worse, remaining a servant until the age of 31. The great planters neither acknowledged nor curtailed their own role in creating far more mixed-raced offspring than did all the free white women in the Chesapeake. By indulging themselves with virtually unlimited power over the bodies of their slaves, masters contradicted their own fantasy of perfecting a distinction between the races. They also sentenced themselves to lives of public denial. Because they were particularly suspicious of free blacks, the Assemblymen of Virginia worked to shrink their numbers and autonomy by rendering their status closer to slavery. After 1691, no Virginia planter could free slaves unless he paid for their transportation beyond the colony. Free blacks lost the right to bear arms, hold office, vote, and employ white servants. They had to pay higher taxes, and the courts inflicted stricter penalties on free blacks than whites convicted for the same crimes. The common and the great planters found a new shared identity in the psychology of race that held every white man superior to every black. A dark skin became synonymous with slavery, just as freedom became equated with whiteness. It was the beginning of a racial social order in America. As skin color became the key marker of identity, race obscured the persistent power of class distinctions between the common planters and the great planters. Newly obsessed with racial difference, Chesapeake whites felt more equal, despite the growing inequality of their economic circumstances. In 1680, William Penn convinced the king to cancel a debt of £16,000 he owed to Penn's late father, the Admiral William Penn. To discharge the debt, the king granted the younger Penn 45,000 square miles west of the Delaware River as the colony of Pennsylvania. Here we have a famous portrait painting of William Penn. A paradoxical man, he combined an elite status with a radical religion. He enjoyed a university education and large landed estates in England and Ireland. His annual income of £2,000 placed Penn near the top of the gentry class. He lived in a grand country house in Sussex. Here are a couple of images of what the estate looks like today. Penn wore expensive clothing with silver buckles, ate and drank abundantly well, kept 3 coaches, and employed a staff of 8 servants. In his colony, he also acquired several slaves. His genteel manners and considerable wealth afforded Penn the political influence and social privileges of a prominent and well-connected courtier. But as a young man, and against his father, the admiral's wishes, Penn had converted to Quakerism, then an especially mystical, radical, and persecuted form of Protestantism. As a wealthy gentleman, Penn was an unusual Quaker, for most were tradesmen, shopkeepers, and small farmers who distrusted conspicuous wealth and state power. In turn, the rich and powerful of the realm generally despised the Quakers. By 17th century standards, Quaker religious beliefs led to radical social conclusions. Here we have a sketch of some late 17th century Quakers. Insisting upon the equality of all persons before God, they tried to dispense with the markers of social hierarchy. They wore plain clothes, refused to take oaths of allegiance or for testimony, and rejected the payment of church taxes. Quakers used plain, familiar language with all people, even to address aristocrats or the king, and they declined to doff their hats before their rulers as a conventional sign of respect. Considering women spiritually equal to men, Quakers established parallel men's and women's leadership for their meetings. Pacifists, they refused to bear arms. Uneasy with slavery, Quakers were among the first to begin urging its abolition. Led by Penn, the Quakers urged a national toleration for all Protestant denominations as legal equals. This vision of Protestant pluralism and tolerance horrified the Anglican authorities within the apparatus of the Church of England. They viewed it as a sure route to atheism via anarchy. Penn's plans for his colony in Pennsylvania expressed his double position as a Quaker and a gentleman, bent on sustaining his own fortune while benefiting his persecuted faith. Putting a Quaker twist on the Puritan concept of a colony as a city upon a hill, Penn spoke of Pennsylvania as what he called a holy experiment and an example to the nations. But in stark contrast to Puritan Massachusetts, Pennsylvania would have no privileged church, no tax-supported religious establishment, not even for the Quakers. Penn certainly meant to provide a haven for his persecuted people, but he spoke in universalistic terms of, in his words, a free colony for all mankind that should go hither. In addition to recruiting Quakers from throughout the British Isles, Penn welcomed both non-Quakers and non-Britons, promising them all equal rights and opportunities. Penn's financial interest also argued for hastening development by welcoming every productive immigrant. In founding a colony, Penn meant to enhance, not sacrifice, his fortune. In promising a free colony, he did not offer free land. for he meant to profit by selling real estate and by collecting annual quit rents. Penn organized the fastest and most efficient colonization in the 17th century English Empire. During 1682, 23 ships from England reached the Delaware River, bearing about 2,000 colonists and their tools, clothes, provisions, and livestock. A year later, 20 more ships brought another 2,000 immigrants. By 1686, Pennsylvania's population exceeded 8,000. Penn established a city and capital named Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. Here we have an illustration of Independence Hall in the heart of the town. Penn designed a systematic grid of broad streets with spacious parks. Within 2 years, the instant city of Philadelphia had about 350 houses and 2,500 inhabitants. Like the New England Puritans, but unlike the Chesapeake colonists, most early Pennsylvanians came in freedom as families of middling means. Most emigrants were Quakers, but the colony also attracted English Anglicans, German Pietists, and Dutch Calvinists. Most settled as farmers in the many rural townships, but some lingered in Philadelphia as artisans and merchants. Pennsylvania proved an ideal setting for colonial settlement by family farmers producing grains and livestock for the transatlantic market and for merchants exporting that produce. The Delaware River offered cheap and easy transportation from the new farms to the port of Philadelphia. In contrast to rocky New England, southeastern Pennsylvania possessed a fertile soil and an easily tilled landscape of low, rolling hills. The new colony also enjoyed a relatively long growing season, but not one so long as to tempt colonists into competing with the Chesapeake in tobacco production, a temptation that would have led to greater extremes of wealth and poverty, freedom and slavery. As in New England, family farms worked primarily by free labor prevailed in early Pennsylvania, which made for an egalitarian distribution of wealth overall. Although warmer than New England, Pennsylvania possessed a healthier and more temperate climate than the hot, humid, and malarial Chesapeake. The healthy conditions, abundant economic opportunities, and relatively even gender division combined to encourage early marriages and numerous children. Although immigration slowed during the 1690s, natural increase sustained a population that nearly doubled from about 11,000 in 1690 to 18,000 by 1700. The Pennsylvanians also benefited from proximity to older colonies sufficiently developed to supply the new colonists until their farms became productive. When those farms did start to produce surpluses, the colonists could sell their livestock and grain to the large West Indian market, which the older colonies had stimulated at mid-century. Pennsylvanians also enjoyed something that no other English colony in the 17th century could boast of: peace with the local Indians. Pennsylvania avoided the conflicts with Indians that had devastated Virginia and New England. The Pennsylvanians benefited because native peoples were relatively weak and few in the Delaware and Susquehanna valleys at the end of the 17th century. The colony also derived security from the sincere and shrewd policy that William Penn adopted to cultivate Indian goodwill. Here we have a painting depicting Penn meeting with the local Indians of the region, known as the Lenni Lenape. In contrast to the blunt intimidation so characteristic of previous colonial leaders, Penn acknowledged the Lenni Lenape as the legitimate owners of the land, and he publicly treated their culture with respect. He allowed settlement only where he had first purchased the lands from the Indians, and he paid higher and fairer prices than had his predecessors in other colonies. Possessed of more land than their reduced numbers could use, the Lenni Lenape welcomed the opportunity to sell some for coveted trade goods. During the late 17th and early 18th centuries, many native peoples fled from mistreatment in other colonies to settle in Pennsylvania. Blessed with hard-working colonists, a prime setting, perfect timing, and peace with native peoples, Pennsylvania prospered. During the early 1700s, economic growth endowed Pennsylvanians with a standard of living superior to that of the New England colonies. Diversity became the defining characteristic of the Middle Colonies, the collective name for New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, because they lay between the Chesapeake and New England. In the early 18th century, the Middle Colonists included English Anglicans, Scots and Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, English Congregationalists, English and Welsh Quakers, Dutch and German Reformed Christians, German and Scandinavian Lutherans, an array of Swiss and German pietistic sects, Irish Catholics, and Dutch Jews. In addition, most of the enslaved Africans preserved their traditional beliefs. Neither any single ethnic group nor religious denomination enjoyed a majority in any Middle Colony. New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania defined a distinctive culture and social order that precociously anticipated the American future. During the 1670s, West Indian planters established a new colony on the Atlantic seaboard north of Florida, but south of the Chesapeake, known as the Carolina Colony. It included present-day North and South Carolina and Georgia. The Carolina Colony officially belonged to a set of English aristocrats, the Lords Proprietor, consisting of 8 powerful political favorites of the king. They remained in England, entrusting the early colonization effort to ambitious men from the British sugar island of Barbados, which we can find on our map image here, circled in red toward the bottom right. South Carolina's background stems from its connections to the island. As sugar production took off in Barbados in the early decades of the 17th century, the profits were rapidly reinvested by planters into the acquisition of more and more slaves from the west coast of Africa. Ultimately, the black population would come to far outnumber the white in Barbados. Here we have a couple of illustrations of slaves at work in the sugarcane fields. And moving the product for shipment overseas. It was the sons of established planters in Barbados, for whom available opportunities ran out on the tiny island, who sought their fortunes in what became South Carolina, and they brought their slaves with them. Here we have a sketch of Charlestown in its earliest days in the 1670s, well before it became the city of Charleston. In this early period, Carolina had not yet found a staple commodity to turn a profit on, and it survived in its early days primarily by raising livestock for export to Barbados. Rice is what would make Carolina planters rich. In fact, the wealthiest in North America, as the profits from rice far exceeded those available through tobacco production. Here we have a couple of sketches of the rice fields in Carolina and slaves at work with the crop. Not a few of the greatest planters became so wealthy off of rice and slave labor that they could afford to spend their summers not on the plantations, but in massive and fabulously decorated mansions in the growing city of Charlestown, where they could sit out the malaria and yellow fever seasons. Some spent their summers back in the mother country, and a few became so wealthy that they returned to England permanently. In the years to come, those riches would also make Carolina planters some of the most powerful political figures in the English colonies, and later the United States. After only a few decades, pioneering life in Carolina gave way to plantation life as the dominant mode of existence. Europeans and Indians rapidly gave way to Africans as the primary demographic presence in the coastal lowlands. By 1720, when the colony's proprietors gave way to a royal government, blacks had already outnumbered Europeans for more than a decade, a reality captured in this painting of the region. As rice production grew exponentially, slave imports in larger and larger numbers began to arrive in Carolina directly from Africa rather than from the Caribbean. A Swiss observer recently arrived in the colony in 1737 declared that Carolina looked, in his words, more like an African country than like a country settled by white people. As the plantation economy expanded and intensified between 1720 and 1741, when slave importation was temporarily halted, black birth rates declined under the harsh regimen of rice production, and in response planters imported more and more slaves, increasing still further Carolina's black majority. Sheer numbers provided the colony's black population with a nucleus around which distinctive social patterns could develop, fostering a tendency towards social and occasionally economic self-sufficiency. From skilled work being hired out in Charleston to various jobs navigating the colony's waterways to the task system of labor on the rice plantations, which allowed for more independence from white control and supervision than tobacco work in the Chesapeake. Enslaved people in Carolina frequently took advantage of the opportunities they had for limited autonomy. Of course, white authorities' anxieties mounted as the numbers of blacks continued to rise in the colony over the course of the early and mid-18th century. When they reacted with various laws designed to control black economic activity, slaves increased more illicit and secret forms of resistance. The more the black community was explicitly prohibited from earning, purchasing, and possessing goods, the more respectable, justifiable, and necessary such clandestine activity became as a way of life. White authorities resorted to various laws designed not only to restrict black economic activity, but increasingly to confine blacks to the most menial jobs and inferior social positions. As white power became more oppressive, the instances of black runaways increased. The most basic form of control imposed by whites amounted to a concerted attempt by masters to establish the continuous whereabouts of their slaves. Laws setting curfews for blacks and requiring them to carry lanterns after dark, for example, characterized this effort. The watch in Charleston and roving patrols in the rest of the colony vigorously policed the movements of blacks. Refusal to stop upon orders could result not just in incarceration, but corporal punishment and even death. Public whippings and even hangings sent a colony-wide message of white control. This system of repression may have extracted from most blacks the outward appearance of conformity, but it also reinforced inner conflict and more extreme forms of resistance, from individual acts of violence, such as poisoning and arson, to large-scale revolt. When in late 1733 the Spanish king offered freedom to all black fugitives reaching St. Augustine from the English colonies, white tensions in Carolina escalated, especially when by the late 1730s not a few slaves had successfully taken the king up on the offer, even establishing their own armed and defensible settlement on the outskirts of St. Augustine, known as Fort Mose, captured in this illustration. Not surprisingly, given the tinderbox of racial tensions the colony sat atop of, in 1739 Carolina faced an uprising among slaves that subsequently became known as the Stono Rebellion. Under an African leader known only as Jemmy, on Sunday, September 9th, the rebels began the violence by stealing guns and gunpowder from a store and killing and decapitating the storekeepers. They began to march south, hoping to reach Fort Mose in Spanish Florida. Here we have a sketch imagining the events of the revolt. Along the way, the rebels' numbers grew to at least 80, and perhaps as many as 100. They burned 7 plantations and killed 20 whites. Desperate to suppress the rebellion lest it succeed and inspire others, the local planters mustered their forces. Possessing horses, more guns, better training in arms, and a militia command structure, the whites could rally overwhelming power. On the second day of the uprising, about 100 armed and mounted white militiamen surprised and routed the rebels, killing most, usually after they had surrendered. To terrify the other slaves, the victors cut off the rebels' heads and placed them on posts, one every mile, between the battlefield along the Stono River and Charleston. 2 years later, in 1741, New York also faced a major slave uprising and conspiracy, one seen as even more potentially dangerous because lower-class whites, namely tavern keepers, were also implicated in the revolt. Planters across the English colonies reacted by stopping the importation of slaves from Africa for a few years afterwards. From the Carolina lowlands to New York City, enslaved African Americans made it clear that the expansion of white liberty and wealth at their expense would never be permitted without paying a perpetual price in fear and anxiety, and sometimes white lives. By way of wrapping up the early colonial period, it's worth reflecting on the fact that the tremendous growth of European colonization in North America and the expansion of white freedom and opportunity in the New World, celebrated still in our textbooks, came at the expense in lives and labor of peoples, both Native American and African American, that can never be measured. The West Country promoters, who envisioned the settlement of the Chesapeake, boasted that the Indians there would welcome them as liberators from Spanish cruelties. The Puritans of New England proclaimed their society a city upon a hill, a beacon light and shining example of a model Christian community. Both colonies engaged in genocidal wars of extermination of Indian peoples. Both bought and sold slaves to enrich themselves. All this profit, murder, and enslavement led directly to the growth of the English colonies, and later the United States. Here in our last image, we have a map of North America as it looked around 1700. Looks can be deceiving. With the Dutch vanquished and the Spanish reduced to the role of meddler in the race for colonial dominance, never having truly recovered from the devastating impact of the ill-fated Armada in 1588, only England and France were left to compete in the contest for imperial dominion in North America. From the map, it looks like maybe the French, with so much more territory, may have held an advantage, but this was not the case. The English settlements did not take up as much geographical space, but packed along the Atlantic seaboard, they were far more densely populated than the French settlements. When war came between the two, the French would need allies to help them hold on to their empire in the Americas. And as we'll see in the next part of the class, they found those allies in the Indians.